All right, so get this. You guys sent in this paper called The Motion Renaissance, Rewriting Science from the Ground Up. And whoa, the title alone, right?
It's definitely a bold claim.
I know, bold claim. And that's why we're diving in today, folks. So to help break it all down, we have an expert in all things physics and beyond.
Happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Okay, so this paper is basically saying that everything is motion time gravity forces, like the stuff we usually think of as like the building blocks of the universe.
Right, the fundamental stuff.
Yeah. They're saying it's all just motion in disguise.
It's interesting, though. The paper isn't just dismissing established science. It's trying to build a new framework. You know, what if we reimagine the entire universe through the lens of motion?
Okay, I am hooked already.
Yeah.
But how does that even work? Like, how can something like time just be motion?
Well, the paper starts by distinguishing between motion and what they call structured motion. So motion at its most basic, that's simply change, right? Anything transitioning from one state to another. Think of it like the constant flow of a river.
I can picture that.
Okay, now imagine that same river, but over eons, it carves out a canyon, right? The water is still flowing, still in motion, but it's now created this predictable, self-reinforcing pattern that's structured motion that stabilizes into something recognizable and persistent.
So is the paper saying that things like atoms, galaxies, even us, we're all just structured motion?
That's the core idea. From the smallest particles to the largest cosmic structures, it's all motion that has organized itself into these complex, self-sustaining patterns.
Wow.
It's like the universe is doing this cosmic dance, and everything we see is just one step in that elaborate choreography. And get this, even our senses are basically motion detectors.
Wait, hold up our senses. How are our senses picking up on motion if everything is already motion?
Think about your eyes. You don't see a static image. You see light hitting your retina, triggering signals that your brain interprets as shapes, colors, movement. It's all about changes in motion. It's like your eyes are constantly taking snapshots of the cosmic dance and your brain is stringing them together into a movie.
Wow, okay, I'm starting to see it. But what about our other senses? Do they work the same way?
Absolutely. The principle applies across the board. Hearing, that's your ears translating vibrations, which are just another form of motion, into sound touch, that's sensing pressure. Kinetic interactions, more motion. Even taste and smell, those are all about detecting motion at the molecular level.
So basically, we're not just experiencing a world of motion. We are motion.
Exactly.
Constantly interpreting and interacting with other forms of motion.
The paper even suggests that our brains are basically prediction machines, constantly anticipating and interpreting those motion patterns based on what we've experienced before.
So it's almost like saying that reality itself is just a giant motion symphony, and we're all playing different instruments in it. But this brings up another big question. Where does time fit into all this?
Time. The paper actually suggests that time, as we traditionally understand it, isn't a fundamental aspect of the universe at all.
Whoa.
It argues that time is a human construct, a tool we invented to measure those motion cycles.
So you're saying that time doesn't actually exist. That's a bit of a mind bender.
It's not that time doesn't exist. It's more that it exists differently than we might imagine. Think of it this way. A year is just a way of tracking the Earth's motion around the sun. A day, that's just the Earth spinning on its axis, clocks, and calendars, are tools we invented to synchronize with those motion patterns. They're not measuring time itself, they're measuring motion.
So instead of thinking of time as a separate dimension, it's more like we're embedded in this constant flow of motion, and time is just our way of measuring it. That's wild.
It is a radical shift in perspective, and the paper goes on to argue that this motion-centric view actually helps us understand some of the biggest mysteries in the universe.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, let's take gravity. We usually think of it as a force pulling objects together, but the paper proposes that gravity isn't a force at all. It's actually large-scale motion synchronization toward equilibrium.
Okay, wait, hold on. I need to unpack that one. How can gravity be motion synchronization?
Imagine objects in space are constantly moving, right? And they're always trying to find the most stable configuration, the one that minimizes their overall motion. It's kind of like finding the most efficient way to dance without bumping into each other. That's what the paper suggests is happening with gravity. It's not that objects are attracted to each other, it's that they're all moving in a way that minimizes their overall motion.
So gravity isn't a pull. It's more like objects are just trying to find the most chilled out way to move through space.
Exactly. It's a shift in perspective, seeing gravity as a consequence of motion rather than a fundamental force in itself. And this applies to other forces as well.
Like, for instance?
Electromagnetism. Think about magnets, they attract or repel each other, right? But what if that's not about charges, but about how their inherent motion patterns are aligning or misaligning?
So instead of positive and negative charges, it's all about how the underlying motion patterns interact.
Precisely. And this idea goes even deeper. The paper suggests that even light, what we think of as photons, is just structured motion.
Wait, light, the stuff that lets us see, that's just motion. How is that even possible?
The paper describes photons not as particles or waves, but as self-sustaining motion formations that transfer synchronized motion. Think of it like a wave traveling through water. The water itself doesn't really move that much, but the wave, the motion keeps propagating.
So you're saying light is like a wave of motion that travels through space, but it's not an actual physical thing, it's just the motion itself.
That's what the paper is proposing. It's definitely different from how we usually think about light, but it fits with this bigger picture of everything being motion.
My head is spinning. It's like we're looking at the universe through a whole new set of glasses.
It is a paradigm shift, no doubt, and it's important to remember that this is just one paper, one perspective on things, but it definitely raises some fascinating questions and opens up some completely new ways of thinking about the world around us.
I'm already hooked, and we're just getting started. Speaking of new ways of thinking, this paper tackles one of the biggest mysteries of modern science, quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics. Now, that's a field where things get really strange.
Right. But this paper claims that even the bizarre world of quantum mechanics starts to make more sense when you see it through the lens of motion.
Okay. Commerce me intrigued. How does the paper tackle something like wave-particle duality?
Well, they say particles aren't actually switching back and forth between waves and particles. They're just structured motion, adapting to different constraints. It's kind of like, you know how water acts differently if it's flowing through a pipe versus crashing on the beach.
So it's not about the fundamental nature of the particle changing, but about how its motion is being structured by its environment.
Exactly. And with quantum entanglement, that spooky action at a distance that Einstein was so puzzled by the paper suggests it's not so spooky after all. It's just instantaneous correlation because the particles share a common history of motion. Imagine two dancers who have rehearsed the same routine perfectly. They move in sync, not because they're communicating telepathically, but because they've practiced together.
So entangled particles are like synchronized dancers. Their movements perfectly correlated because they're both following the same motion script.
That's a great way to put it. The paper argues that the shared history of motion is what allows for that seemingly instantaneous connection across vast distances.
That's a pretty elegant explanation, stripping away some of the mystery surrounding those quantum phenomena. I'm starting to see how this motion-centric view could really shake things up.
Oh, it definitely shakes things up.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. This paper goes as far as reimagining the Big Bang itself.
Now, hold on. Even the Big Bang. How does a motion-centric view explain the origin of the universe?
They call it the big motion event. And instead of viewing it as an explosion, it's more like a massive motion cascade that disrupted a state of equilibrium. Imagine a perfectly still pond, and then suddenly you drop a pebble in, and it creates ripples that spread out in all directions.
Yeah.
It's kind of how the paper describes the Big Bang.
So instead of an explosion of matter and energy, it's more like an explosion of motion that sets the entire universe in motion. I like the imagery.
Right. It's like this primal dance that kicked off everything we see today.
This is really making me rethink some fundamental assumptions about the universe. We've covered a lot of ground just in this first part. I can't wait to see where this deep dive takes us next. Welcome back. We left off talking about the Big Bang, or should we say, the big motion event, and how this paper reframes even the origin of the universe through the lens of motion. But let's bring this down to earth. Literally, how does this idea of everything being motion explain life itself? I mean, we're not just rocks tumbling through space, are we?
Right. And the paper dives into this, suggesting that life is just a really, really cool form of structured motion. Self-organizing, adaptive, and constantly replicating. It's like the universe learned how to make photocopies, but instead of paper, it's using motion.
Okay, I'm listening. So we're not just talking about how animals move or plants grow, but life itself is a manifestation of motion. That's a big statement.
It is. Think about evolution, the way species change over time. That's basically a never-ending process of motion optimization. Organisms are always adapting, tweaking their motion patterns to better survive in their environments. It's like a cosmic dance competition where the best movers get to stay on the dance floor.
I like that analogy, but what about the stuff happening inside us? Things like metabolism, DNA. How do those fit into this motion framework?
Well, the paper describes metabolism as molecular motion processing for energy. It's all about how molecules are constantly moving and interacting to create the energy needed for life. It's like a super tiny, super fast dance party happening inside every cell.
And DNA, that's the blueprint of life, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the paper sees DNA as structured motion that encodes those biological blueprints. It's like a set of instructions for how to build and maintain an organism, all written in the language of motion.
So from the grand scale of the Big Bang to the tiniest bits of life, it's all motion. But let's zoom back in on us humans for a minute. We do a lot more than just survive, right? We build societies, create art, ponder the meaning of life. Where does all that fit into this motion picture?
That's where it gets really interesting. The paper argues that pretty much everything humans have ever done is essentially motion manipulation. We've learned to harness motion to shape our world and ourselves in incredibly complex ways.
I can see that with technology. From the wheel to the smartphone, it's all about controlling motion to do what we want. But what about the less tangible stuff? Our culture, our art, our ideas are those motion too.
The paper suggests they are, think about language. It's how we take motion-based information and encode it into symbolic patterns. Writing takes a step further, allowing us to store and share those motion-based messages across time and space. It's like we found a way to freeze-frame the cosmic dance and share it with others.
So language and writing are like a way of capturing and sharing the patterns of the cosmic dance.
Exactly. And it gets even cooler when you think about art and music. The paper describes these as expressive ways of encoding and restructuring motion patterns. Music is literally synchronized auditory motion vibrations, creating patterns that we experience as melodies and rhythms. It's like the universe is singing to us through the language of motion.
Okay, that's giving me chills. It's like we're not just observers of the cosmic dance, we're active participants expressing ourselves through the very language of motion. But what about something like religion? That's a big part of human experience for many people. How does the paper address the spiritual side of things?
That's where it gets a bit philosophical. The paper suggests that even religion can be seen as a structured motion framework that guides human behavior and beliefs. It's like we're creating meaning and order out of the chaos of motion.
So even our search for meaning, our desire to understand the bigger picture, it's all part of this grand dance of motion. That's a pretty profound thought.
It is. And the paper goes on to suggest that this idea of manipulating motion is at the core of pretty much everything we do as humans, from our basic survival instincts to the most complex systems we've created.
I can see that we've built our societies, our economies, our entire civilization on our ability to harness and control motion. Think about farming. It's manipulating the motion cycles of plants and animals to ensure we have food. Medicine is all about stabilizing and enhancing biological motion to promote health.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. Even money, in a way, is just a representation of the ability to control motion, to buy goods, services, or labor. It's like we've built our entire world on this foundation of motion manipulation.
And as our technology gets more advanced, that manipulation is becoming even more powerful, right?
Absolutely. The paper talks about how technologies like artificial intelligence are essentially structured digital intelligence that optimizes motion data and interactions. It's like a supercharged version of our own brains, able to process motion information and make decisions at an incredible speed.
And then there's space travel, the ultimate frontier. We're literally trying to manipulate motion to propel ourselves across the vastness of space.
Right. The paper sees space travel as the next logical step in this grand human story of motion mastery.
Yeah.
It's like we're finally learning to dance among the stars. But with all this power to control motion, it also raises some serious questions, right?
Absolutely. If everything is motion and we're becoming masters of manipulating it, what are the implications? What does it mean for our future as a species?
That's the big question, and it's one we'll dive into further in the next part of this deep dive. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the motion renaissance. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it?
It really has.
I know. We've explored this idea that everything is motion, from atoms and galaxies to our own bodies, and even our thoughts. It's all part of this cosmic dance.
Definitely a paradigm shift, for sure, reframing how we see the universe and our place within it.
Right. And we've talked about how humans are becoming masters of motion manipulation, shaping the world around us in increasingly complex ways. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this one big question. What are the implications of all this?
Yeah.
What does it mean for the future of humanity if we're truly entering a motion renaissance?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
This paper doesn't just present a new scientific theory, it's proposing a whole new worldview. And with any major shift in understanding, there comes this wave of both opportunities and challenges.
So let's start with the exciting stuff.
Hmm.
What are some potential benefits of seeing the world through this motion lens?
Well, on a practical level, understanding motion at this fundamental level could lead to some incredible technological advancements.
Okay.
Imagine harnessing the power of motion to create new forms of clean energy,
Right.
develop materials with unheard of properties, or even manipulate space and time itself.
Okay, now that's getting into some serious sci-fi territory. But I can see how this kind of thinking could lead to some truly groundbreaking innovations. We're
Yeah.
basically talking about rewriting the rules of the game, right?
Exactly. But along with those incredible possibilities, there are also potential risks and ethical dilemmas we need to consider.
Oh, yeah.
If everything is motion and we become capable of manipulating it at such a fundamental level, who gets to control that power? And how do we ensure it's used for good?
That's a huge question. It's like we're given the keys to the universe's engine room, but we don't yet have the instruction manual.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the need for these thoughtful and inclusive conversations about the ethics of motion manipulation. We need to consider the potential impacts on society, on our environment, and even on the very fabric of reality itself.
So we're basically talking about a whole new set of ethical guidelines for a motion-powered future.
Precisely, and those conversations need to happen across disciplines involving scientists, philosophers, policymakers, everyday citizens. We need to collectively decide what kind of future we want to build with this newfound understanding of motion.
It's both exhilarating and a little daunting, isn't it?
It is.
We're standing on the edge of a whole new era of scientific understanding, but it comes with this huge responsibility to use that knowledge wisely.
It does, but this paper also offers some really profound insights into what it means to be human in a motion-driven universe.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, if we accept the premise that everything is motion, even our consciousness, our thoughts and feelings are just intricate patterns of motion,
Right.
it challenges us to rethink our place in the cosmos. We're not separate from the universe. We're woven into its very fabric, part of this grand cosmic dance.
It's a beautiful and humbling way to look at it. Instead of feeling small and insignificant in the face of this vast universe, we're actually integral parts of it, each playing our own unique role in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. And this perspective can even bridge the gap between science and spirituality. Instead of seeing them as separate domains, they become different lenses for understanding the same fundamental reality, the reality of motion.
It's like science is giving us the mechanics of the dance, while spirituality explores the meaning and beauty of it.
I like that. And it suggests that this motion renaissance is about more than just scientific breakthroughs. It's about a fundamental shift in how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the universe.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of awe and excitement, but also a sense of responsibility. The elegance of this motion-centric view of the universe, excitement for the potential it holds, and responsibility to ensure that we navigate this new era wisely and ethically.
I couldn't agree more. And as always, we encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. Because the future of the motion renaissance, the future of how we understand and interact with motion, is ultimately up to all of us.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the motion renaissance. Until next time, keep those curious minds engaged and keep on diving deep.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something really different. It's this source called the Motion Renaissance. And, well, it's basically trying to rewrite all of science as we know it.
Yeah, it's pretty ambitious.
Yeah.
The core idea is that the most fundamental thing in the universe isn't time or gravity, but motion. It says everything we experience is really just motion in different form.
Everything. Like, how does that even work? Where do they even start with that?
Well, they start by looking at the very building blocks of reality. So instead of particles and forces, they focus on what they call motion and structured motion.
Motion. Okay, that makes sense. But what's structured motion?
So basic motion is like any kind of change. But structured motion, that's when motion stabilizes into like predictable patterns and cycles. Imagine like a chaotic gust of wind versus the steady rhythm of ocean waves,
Okay, yeah, I can see that. So where does, like, the Big Bang fit into all of this? If everything is motion, how did it all begin?
Right, well, they reimagined the Big Bang as what they call the Great Motion Event. It's like this huge cascade of motion that disrupted everything and created the structured motion patterns we see as, well, energy and matter and all that.
So instead of an explosion of stuff, it's like an explosion of motion.
Exactly. And from that initial cascade, all the complexity of the universe arises. Galaxies, stars, planets, everything, all just expressions of this structured motion.
Whoa, okay. That's a lot to take in. It's like a whole new origin story for the universe. But how does this motion-based view, how does it play into our daily lives? You know, how we experience the world around us?
Yeah, well, that's where it gets really interesting. It says our senses, like our sight, hearing, touch, they're all essentially motion detectors.
Motion detectors.
Yeah. So like your eyes don't actually see objects. What they do is detect motion and translate those patterns into signals your brain can understand. It's kind of like your eyes are constantly taking snapshots of motion and using those to build a picture of the world.
So we're not seeing things, we're seeing how things move.
Exactly. And it's not just sight. Hearing is detecting vibrations. Touch is about pressure and interactions. Even smell and taste involve molecules moving around.
Hold on. So if all our senses are doing is picking up motion, doesn't that mean that, like, our whole reality is kind of constructed by how we interpret those motions?
That's a big part of it, yeah. The idea is that reality is this dynamic interplay between the universe's inherent motion and how our brains make sense of it. It's like we're swimming in this sea of motion, and our senses are the tools we use to navigate it.
Okay, my head is spinning a little bit here. But what about time? Where does time fit into this whole motion framework? It feels like time is pretty fundamental.
Well, that's where things get really radical. The source argues that time isn't actually a fundamental dimension of the universe. It's just something we created to measure motion cycles.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying time doesn't exist?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it exists in the sense that motion exists, right? Think about it. What are years, days, hours? They're all just ways to measure the cyclical movements of planets and stars.
Okay, so a year is just one cycle of the Earth around the sun, and a day is one spin of the Earth.
Right. Time is just a tool we use to measure and synchronize our experiences with the cycles of the universe.
Okay, so it's not that time is an illusion, it's just that it's relative to the motion, not some absolute thing.
Precisely.
Wow. So we've got motion as the basis of everything. Our senses are picking up motion. Time is how we measure motion. I mean, this motion renaissance really is comprehensive. What about life? How do they define what it means to be alive?
They define life as self-organizing, adaptive, and self-replicating structured motion systems. Basically, living things are really complex patterns of motion that maintain themselves, respond to their environment, and can make copies of themselves.
So we're all just really, really organized motion that's able to keep itself going.
That's putting it simply, but yeah, that's the gist. All the things we associate with life, like breathing, digestion, even our cells dividing, it's all about motion on different scales.
Okay, so we've gone from the beginning of the universe to our senses to the definition of life, and it all comes back to motion. This motion renaissance really is something else.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface. This source, it goes on to apply this framework to everything, even things like the fundamental forces of physics and even consciousness.
Oh, okay, I think I need a minute to process all of that. But before we jump into those even crazier ideas, let's take a quick break and let this all sink in for a bit. Okay, we're back, and honestly, my mind is still blown from that last segment. It's crazy to think that motion could be the key to understanding, well, everything. What other big ideas does this motion renaissance try to explain?
It dives into some of the biggest mysteries out there, like, dark matter and dark energy.
Yeah, those are concepts that even when scientists try to explain them, I get lost.
Right, they're huge puzzles. And this source says maybe we're thinking about them all wrong.
Okay, how so?
So with dark matter, instead of looking for some, invisible particle, it suggests what we're seeing is unrecognized structured motion synchronization.
So instead of some new kind of particle, it's just motion we haven't fully grasped yet because it's on such a huge scale.
Exactly. They argue that we've been so focused on what dark matter is that we haven't looked closely enough at how motion itself might be acting on a cosmic level to create these effects, the gravitational effects.
Interesting. So it's not about finding something new. It's about understanding what's already there in a new way.
Yeah.
What about dark energy, that mysterious force that's like pushing the universe apart?
Well, the source looks at that through motion too. It says instead of a separate force, maybe dark energy is a result of how structured motion redistributes itself across the universe.
So it's an inherent property of motion, not a different thing altogether. Wow. This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about the universe. It's like turning everything upside down. But it doesn't stop at just reinterpreting stuff we already know, right? This source also talks about what this motion renaissance could mean for our future.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. A future where understanding motion leads to huge breakthroughs in tech, medicine, maybe even space travel.
That sounds like we're entering the world of sci-fi here. What specific examples do they give?
Well, one example is motion-based computing. Imagine computers that use motion at the quantum level to process information. So not just faster computers, but a completely different way of computing.
That's wild.
Yeah.
All thanks to a better understanding of motion.
Yeah, and it goes beyond computers. The source suggests we could create new types of energy, sustainable energy, tapping into the motion that's already all around us in wind and waves, heat even, instead of relying on burning things for fuel.
That would be incredible. What about space travel? Does it suggest anything about that? Could we, travel to different galaxies?
Well, maybe not to other galaxies just yet. But it does talk about developing totally new propulsion systems. So not rockets, but systems that, can you imagine, manipulate space-time itself, riding the waves of motion to reach distant stars.
That is amazing. It seems like if we can really understand motion, the possibilities are endless. So if this whole motion renaissance is so groundbreaking and powerful, why is it only coming about now? Why haven't we always understood the universe this way?
The source suggests is because up until now, we've been limited by how we see things. We tend to put knowledge in boxes, physics over here, biology over there, chemistry over there, instead of seeing how they all connect.
So we've been too focused on the details to see the bigger picture.
Right. And they say motion is the thread that runs through all these different areas of science. Understanding motion is the key to seeing those connections and getting a much deeper understanding of how it all works.
It's like putting on a special pair of glasses that lets you see the world clearly for the first time. But this new perspective, it also brings up some really big questions, doesn't it? If everything really is motion, what does that mean for us as humans, for consciousness? What does it mean for reality itself?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what the source wants us to think about. It pushes us to go beyond our usual way of thinking, to see a more holistic picture of the universe and how we fit into it.
It's like it's asking us to let go of this idea that we're separate and in control and just embrace the flow of everything.
Yeah, and by doing that, the source suggests we might find a deeper sense of connection and meaning, letting go of the illusion that we're separate from everything else and seeing how we're all part of something bigger, a more harmonious way of existing.
It's definitely a beautiful idea, but I think it's also a little bit intimidating. Where do we even begin to grasp something this big, this different?
Well, the source emphasizes that this is a process. It's not about getting to a final answer. It's about asking new questions, exploring new ideas, being open to challenging our own beliefs.
So not forgetting everything we already know, but seeing it through a new lens, a lens that shows us the motion that connects everything.
Exactly. And that's what makes this motion renaissance so fascinating. It's not giving us all the answers. It's an invitation to go on a new adventure of discovery, one that could lead us to a much deeper understanding of the universe and our place within it.
I have to say, this has been an incredible deep dive. I know I'm going to be thinking about these ideas for a long time. It's like I've caught a glimpse of a whole new reality, one that's always been there, but I just couldn't see it before.
That's the power of shifting our perspective. It opens up possibilities we never even imagined. And who knows what else we might find as we continue to explore this motion-centric view of the universe.
Before we get too carried away here, I think we need to take a moment to let all this sink in again. We'll be back soon to wrap up our exploration of this fascinating motion renaissance.
We're back, and I'm telling you, my brain is still buzzing from all this motion renaissance stuff. It's a lot to process. It sounds simple to say everything is motion, but actually grasping what that means for everything, it's huge.
Yeah, it's a really big shift in how we think. And like you said, it takes time. But that's what makes it so interesting, right? It's not just about new scientific ideas. It's about a whole new way of looking at the world and ourselves.
One thing that stuck with me is this idea that even consciousness, our sense of self, could be seen as motion. That's pretty far out there from how we normally think about the mind.
Right. It is. And the source, it doesn't shy away from that at all. It says that maybe consciousness is like the most complex example of structured motion we know, this self-aware pattern that can actually reflect on itself and interact with the universe in all these amazing ways. So instead of thinking of the mind as separate from the physical world, they're saying it's all part of this one big web of motion.
Exactly. It's like breaking down this wall we've built between mind and matter. saying that they're both expressions of this one fundamental thing, motion.
That's wild. It makes you wonder, could we maybe one day understand things like, thoughts, emotions, creativity even, through this lens of motion?
Absolutely. That's one of the really exciting paths this motion renaissance opens up.
Right.
Imagine studying the brain's motion patterns to figure out how creativity works or how emotions happen. It could revolutionize psychology, neuroscience, even art.
It's like we're on the edge of a whole new chapter of understanding. But I have to imagine not everyone's going to be on board with all this. I mean, the idea that everything, even our thoughts and feelings, are just patterns of motion, that's going to be a hard pill to swallow for some people.
Of course. Change is always tough. This framework, it really challenges some deep-seated beliefs about who we are and what reality is. It's asking us to let go of this idea that we're separate, that we have control.
It's like it's saying, surrender to the flow of the universe. See yourself as part of this huge cosmic dance instead of this lone individual trying to force their will on everything.
And the source suggests that by surrendering, we might actually find a deeper connection, a sense of purpose even.
Mm-hmm.
If we can let go of this idea of separation and embrace the fact that we're all connected, it could lead to a much more harmonious way of existing.
That's a really beautiful idea, but it's also a bit overwhelming, Where do we even begin to wrap our heads around something this big?
The key is, the source emphasizes this, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about being curious, asking questions, exploring your ideas, and, being ready to challenge what we think we know.
So it's not about throwing out everything. It's about seeing it all through this new lens, the lens of motion, seeing the motion that connects it all.
Exactly. That's what makes this motion renaissance so exciting. It's not about having all the answers. It's an invitation to explore, to question, to keep discovering.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. I know I'll be thinking about this for a long time to come. I feel like I've gotten this glimpse of a whole new reality, one that was always there. I just couldn't see it before.
That's the amazing thing about shifting perspectives, right? It shows us possibilities we couldn't have imagined before. And who knows what else we'll find as we keep exploring this whole motion-centric view of the universe.
To everyone listening, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas too. The source, the motion renaissance, is a great starting point. But the real journey starts when you begin to apply these ideas to your own life and experiences.
Yeah, ask yourself, how does motion shape your life? Your interactions with people? What new things might you discover if you start to see things through this motion-centric lens?
We don't have all the answers, but that's kind of the beauty of this motion renaissance. It's an invitation to explore, to question, to keep learning and discovering.
And to keep that spirit of exploration going. We'll leave you with this thought. If everything is motion, what does that mean for you? What does it mean for your place in this grand cosmic dance?
Keep those questions in mind, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And, today we're going to explore what if everything is just motion?
Motion, you say?
Yeah. So like everything from like the smallest particles to, to the way we live our lives. It's a fascinating idea.
Definitely.
Yeah. So our source material today, it's called Welcome to the Motion Renaissance.
Okay.
And it lays out this big idea that reality itself, can be explained like through this lens of motion.
I like it.
So get ready because we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting concepts today.
Yeah, I mean, it is truly a fascinating approach. It suggests that if we understand motion, we can unlock the secrets of the universe.
Right.
Yeah. And the source, it dives right in. It breaks down matter in a way I've never really thought about before.
Yeah.
So it starts with the tiniest building blocks, like quarks.
Okay.
Those particles that are inside protons and neutrons. And it proposes that these quarks are actually motion loops.
Motion loops. Okay. So they're like little, tiny, almost like circles, spinning around or something.
That's the idea. Yeah. And then it scales up. It suggests that protons and neutrons themselves are systems of these synchronized motion loops.
Wow.
Forming the nucleus of an atom.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like building up from these tiny little motions to bigger and bigger motions.
Exactly. And it doesn't even stop there.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The source goes on to describe electrons as motion shells that sync up with the nucleus to form atoms. So it's like this cosmic dance.
I love that.
With these particles finding stable motion patterns to create the elements.
That make up everything.
That make up everything around us. Yeah.
That's so cool.
It is pretty mind-blowing. And what's even more intriguing is this idea that mass itself, something we usually think of as a fundamental property
Right. Yeah.
is simply resistance to motion redistribution.
Okay, so explain that a little bit more.
So imagine like a bowling ball.
Okay, yeah.
It's hard to move, right? Because it resists any change to its motion.
Right.
And that resistance is what we experience as mass.
Oh, okay.
That's how the source explains it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's amazing how the source is able to connect these like big, kind of heady concepts through this like simple framework of motion.
Yeah. It's pretty elegant.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting when we start talking about bigger things like human society.
Yeah. Like, how does this apply to our everyday lives, right?
Great.
Well, so the source says politics becomes a structured negotiation to influence the motion trajectories of society,
Okay.
while the military focuses on controlling motion more strategically.
Okay, so it's like about like who has the power to like steer where things are going.
Exactly. And even social media gets reframed
Oh gosh.
as a
yeah.
network designed to capture and redirect our cognitive motion patterns.
Oh, it's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like every day, they're getting better and better at doing that, at figuring out like, okay, how do we, make people, scroll or click on this or that or buy this or that.
It really makes you think about all the influences around us all the time, right? Like the constant nudges shaping our thoughts and actions.
Yeah.
And the source even talks about education, and they kind of playfully call it structured motion training.
Structured motion training. Okay.
Aimed at aligning us with like existing knowledge patterns. They even go so far as to call school institutionalized structured motion conditioning.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
It's definitely a different way to think about it.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
There's certain ways of thinking that we're kind of taught or conditioned to follow.
It makes you wonder if that's all learning is right.
Right.
Are we just being like molded to fit into existing systems?
Or is there a way to like break free and discover like new motions, new patterns?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And the source really wants us to think about that.
Right.
And this whole motion-based perspective, it extends even further.
Even further than that.
It
Right?
goes into our personal lives.
Oh, wow.
Everything from our leisure activities, our relationships, even something like dieting.
Mm-hmm.
The source calls all of these human motion constructs.
Okay, so that's kind of like saying that like, like all of our activities are just like different ways of like moving through life, like different patterns of motion.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So if you think about it like entertainment,
Yeah.
like movies and music and video games,
Mm-hmm.
the source says those are all just structured sensory motion manipulation.
That's like they're designed to like, capture our attention and like make us move in a certain way through that experience.
They're playing with our senses to guide our motion.
Right.
And then there's sports.
Right.
They become less about athleticism in this framework
Uh-huh.
and more about like, structured motion efficiency challenges.
So it's like, how well can you control your motion to like achieve a certain goal?
Exactly.
Like, how efficiently can you move?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even marriage.
Marriage. Wow. Okay.
The source redefines that as a structured partnership contract, synchronizing human motion trajectories.
Okay. That's a mouthful. So it's like saying that, two people are kind of like aligning their paths, their motion through life together.
Yeah. It's like finding a partner to synchronize your movements with through life's journey.
Yeah.
It's a unique perspective for sure.
It really is. It makes you think about, like how much control do we actually have over our own motion, over our own destiny?
That's the big question, right? It's like, are we just playing out these patterns or are we actually in the driver's seat?
Yeah. And if we are just these patterns of motion, then, does that make us more predictable than we think?
Food for thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into this motion-based view of the universe. Stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
It's pretty amazing how this like motion-centric view can, go beyond like just, our everyday lives and, try to explain like some of the biggest questions out there.
Like the mysteries of the universe and, the really big philosophical questions.
Right, exactly. And so like, does the source give us any insight into like, these huge questions through this lens of motion?
It definitely tries to. It, delves into the concept of time travel.
Okay.
And basically says it's impossible because time is just a measure of structured motion.
So there's like no separate like dimension of time to travel through?
Exactly. It argues that time is not a thing in itself. It's just how we track motion.
Oh, wow. So those dreams of like hopping in a time machine are just dreams.
Seems that way, yeah.
But what about something like free will? I mean, the source talks about that too, right?
Absolutely. It suggests that free will is not like some mystical force or, predetermined by fate or anything like that. Instead, it's like a motion pattern that adapts to constraints.
So our choices are shaped by motion, but not predetermined.
That's the idea. Think of it like navigating a maze.
Okay.
You have choices at each turn, right?
Right.
But the structure of the maze influences your path.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Because you can't, just walk through walls.
Exactly. You're limited by the constraints.
Right. Okay, but what about another one of those, like, supposed fundamental limits? The speed of light.
Oh, yes. The ultimate speed limit.
Right. But the source challenges that too, doesn't it?
It does. It claims that the speed of light isn't an absolute barrier, but rather the maximum rate at which motion can be redistributed under the current conditions.
So it's saying, like, maybe we could break this barrier if we could change those conditions.
Potentially, yeah. It's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah. So what other, like, scientific givens does the source, like, try to debunk?
Oh, it goes on to debunk several other widely accepted scientific concepts.
Like what?
Well, for example, the source argues that wave function collapse in quantum mechanics doesn't actually happen.
Okay.
Instead, it suggests that what we observe is simply motion adapting to measurement constraints.
So, like, observation itself becomes like a motion interaction that influences the system.
Precisely. Think of it like observing a spinning coin. You only see heads or tails, but the coin was spinning with both possibilities before you looked.
Oh, okay. Okay, that makes sense. So it's not that the act of observation, like, creates reality.
Yeah.
It's just that it kind of, like, forces it to settle into a specific state.
Right. It's like the motion was already there, but our observation kind of like freezes it in a particular way.
Wow, that is a fascinating perspective.
Yeah.
Are there any other examples of how the source, like, reinterprets, these scientific concepts through this motion lens?
Definitely. The concept of the multiverse, for example.
Oh, yeah. The idea that there were, like, infinite parallel universes out there.
Exactly. The source kind of puts a new spin on that.
Okay, how so?
Well, it suggests that what we might perceive as separate universes are simply different expressions of motion's adaptability within a single system.
So it's not like there are actually, like, an infinite number of separate universes.
Not necessarily, no.
It's more like there are all these different possibilities
Right.
within, like, one big universe.
Within one unified system.
Yeah, okay. That is really interesting. And what about entropy? That idea that the universe is, like, slowly moving towards disorder.
Yeah, the heat death of the universe.
Right, where everything just kind of, like, fizzles out eventually.
The source challenges that idea, too.
Okay.
It proposes that motion never really stops. It just kind of like restructures itself.
Oh, wow.
Constantly redistributing itself, maybe leading to new cycles of complexity and order. Even in a seemingly dead universe, there could be this constant dance of motion playing out at levels we can't perceive.
So it's like even if everything seems to be running down, there's still this, like, underlying motion that's, like, driving everything forward.
Exactly. Motion is the fundamental principle. It never truly disappears.
That is really, really interesting. It's like this motion framework can kind of tie everything together.
Yeah.
From the smallest particles to the biggest questions about existence.
That's the beauty of it. It's a unifying principle.
Yeah, and it makes me think about quantum mechanics, which is so often, like, shrouded in mystery and paradox.
Oh, yeah. Quantum mechanics is definitely a weird one.
It is. And so does the source shed any light on this realm through the lens of motion?
Absolutely. It dives headfirst into quantum mechanics.
Okay, good.
And suggests that, its seemingly strange and counterintuitive nature can be explained by understanding motion at a very small scale.
Okay.
It starts by reframing wave-particle duality.
So that's the idea that particles can act like both waves and particles.
Right. And the source suggests that this isn't a paradox, but rather motion adapting to different constraints.
So it's not that particles are, like, magically switching back and forth.
No.
It's that their motion is just behaving differently depending on the situation.
Exactly. It's like water,
Okay.
It can flow smoothly like a wave or crash like a collection of individual droplets depending on what it encounters.
Oh, that's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that quantum mechanics is, like, inherently random or weird.
Right.
It's just that it's all about how motion plays out under specific conditions.
Precisely. And the source goes on to address other perplexing quantum phenomena, too.
Like what?
Well, like quantum entanglement, for example.
Okay, yeah, where two particles seem to be linked across vast distances.
Yeah.
and they like influence each other instantly.
Right, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does the source explain that?
Well, instead of resorting to, some mysterious force acting across space,
Right.
it suggests that this is simply a consequence of synchronized motion states. These particles are like two dancers perfectly mirroring each other's movements.
Wow, I love that.
They're connected by a shared motion pattern, not by some, spooky force.
It's a very elegant way to look at entanglement.
Yeah.
So it's like they're not really communicating faster than light. They're just like,
Yeah.
two parts of the same motion pattern.
Exactly, like two sides of the same coin.
Right.
Right.
Okay. And does the source talk about other mind-boggling quantum concepts like superposition and quantum tunneling?
Oh, it addresses them all.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Superposition, for example.
So that's the idea that a particle can exist in multiple states at the same time.
Right, until it's measured.
Until it's observed.
Yeah. The source reframes that as motion maintaining multiple potential paths until it's forced to settle into a final state.
Okay, so it's like, it's not that the particle is actually in multiple states at once.
Right.
It's that its motion is just like spread out across all these possibilities.
Exactly. It's like a ball rolling down a hill with multiple branching paths. It can take any of them, but once it chooses, the other possibilities disappear.
Oh, that's a really good analogy. Okay, and what about quantum tunneling, where particles seem to like pass through barriers that they shouldn't be able to?
Yeah, that one's a head-scratcher for sure.
It is. So how does motion play into that?
The source explains quantum tunneling as motion finding the least resistant pathway,
But
like water flowing around a rock. Instead of thinking of particles as like solid objects bouncing off barriers,
right.
imagine them as waves that can spread out and find new routes through seemingly impossible obstacles. Oh, that's cool. So it's like they're not actually like tunneling through anything.
Not in the traditional sense. No.
They're just like flowing around it like water.
Exactly. Motion always finds a way.
And what about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? The one that says we can't know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect accuracy.
Ah, yes. Another fundamental principle of quantum mechanics.
Right. So does the source give that one a makeover too?
It does.
Yeah.
It suggests that this isn't about some inherent uncertainty in nature,
Okay.
but rather about measurement interference. Observation itself is another motion interaction that disrupts the system, making it impossible to perfectly measure both position and momentum at the same time.
Oh, okay. So it's like when we try to measure something,
Yeah.
we're actually like interfering with its motion.
Precisely. It's like trying to measure the speed of a rolling ball by poking it.
Yeah.
Your poke will inevitably change its speed and direction.
Right. So it's not that we can't know these things in principle.
Right.
It's just that the act of measuring them changes them. Exactly. Measurement itself is a form of motion interaction.
Wow. It's incredible how this motion-based framework can seemingly explain even the most counterintuitive aspects of quantum mechanics.
It's a powerful framework for sure.
It is. But what about the world that's closer to home? Does the source explore how motion plays out in the natural world, beyond like subatomic particles and all that?
It absolutely does. The source marvels at how nature has optimized motion for efficiency and survival,
Okay.
offering some really captivating examples.
Like what?
Well, it highlights flocks of birds, for instance,
Okay.
and how they synchronize their aerial motion for these rapid coordinated movements.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing how they can all move together like that.
It is amazing. It allows them to navigate and evade predators with incredible agility.
So it's like a motion-based survival strategy.
Exactly. Motion is key to survival in the animal kingdom.
Right. Are there any other examples that show nature's mastery of motion?
Right, there are so many. The source also talks about schools of fish, which utilize collective motion to minimize energy loss and avoid predators.
Oh, that's cool. So moving as a group helps them to travel farther and stay safe.
Precisely. It's all about efficiency and survival through optimized motion.
Wow, nature is so smart. It's like it's figured out all these elegant solutions to problems through motion.
And there are even more amazing examples.
Yeah.
The source talks about the electric eel, for instance,
Okay.
which generates motion-driven voltage surges for both hunting and defense.
Oh, wow. So it's like using motion to create electricity.
Exactly. By rapidly contracting specialized muscle cells, it creates a powerful electrical discharge that can stun prey or deter attackers.
That is so cool. It's like a living taser.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, and what about speed and agility? Does the source highlight any species that are really good at that?
Oh, absolutely. It discusses the cheetah.
Okay.
which is like a masterpiece of terrestrial motion efficiency.
They're so fast.
They are incredibly fast. They can reach those speeds in just seconds thanks to their streamlined body and powerful leg muscles.
Wow. So it's like evolution has optimized them for pure speed.
Precisely, motion is speed in this case.
Right, right. Are there any examples of creatures that take a different approach? You know, like maybe they're not fast, but
Yeah,
they've mastered motion in a slower, more deliberate way.
definitely. The source highlights tardigrades, for example.
Oh, those microscopic creatures that can survive like anything.
Exactly. They can survive extreme conditions by essentially suspending their internal motion processes.
Wait, so they like slow down their motion to survive?
Precisely. They enter a state of suspended animation, slowing down their metabolism and motion to an almost undetectable level.
Wow.
It allows them to withstand extreme temperatures, radiation, even the vacuum of space.
That is incredible. It's like they've mastered the art of slowing down motion to an extreme degree.
They are the masters of motion manipulation for sure.
And there are even more fascinating examples.
Oh
Right?
yeah, countless examples.
Like what?
Well, the source describes the octopus,
Okay.
which is known for its remarkable shape-shifting camouflage.
Yeah, they can like blend in with anything.
Exactly. And that ability to blend seamlessly into its surroundings is also about motion adaptation.
Okay.
It allows the octopus to disappear in plain sight by rapidly changing the color and texture of its skin.
So it's like they're using motion to manipulate their appearance.
Precisely. It's another example of how motion is key to survival in the animal kingdom.
Wow. Nature is just full of these mind-blowing examples of motion optimization.
It really is. Everywhere you look, from the smallest particles to the largest organisms, motion is the underlying principle driving everything.
It seems like this source is really making a case for a motion renaissance.
A complete shift in how we understand the universe and our place within it.
So it really seems like this source is making a case for like a motion renaissance.
Yeah.
You know, like a whole new way of looking at the universe.
Yeah, a complete paradigm shift in how we understand reality.
Yeah. And after this deep dive, I have to admit, it's hard not to see the world differently now.
Right. It's like you can't unsee it once you start thinking about everything in terms of motion.
Yeah, everything is moving and shifting and interacting, even when things seem still on the surface.
Exactly. There's this constant dance of motion happening at every level.
From the tiniest particles to the largest structures in the cosmos.
And that's really the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
This motion-based perspective encourages us to look beyond the surface to see the dynamic processes underlying everything.
It's like gaining a whole new set of lenses to view reality.
Yeah, revealing the interconnectedness and the constant flux of the universe.
It's a really powerful shift in perspective, but I'm curious, what does this all mean for us practically? Does seeing everything as structured motion change how we live our lives or how we understand ourselves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that the source leaves open for us to ponder.
Okay.
But it does suggest that if we can truly grasp these principles of motion, we can potentially unlock all sorts of new possibilities in science and technology and even our understanding of consciousness.
So what kind of possibilities are we talking about here?
Well, imagine being able to manipulate motion at a fundamental level.
Right.
What could we achieve?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we could revolutionize energy production, maybe transportation medicine, even perhaps unlock the secrets of longevity and consciousness.
It's a really exciting vision of the future where understanding motion becomes the key to a whole new era of human progress.
It is, but it also kind of raises some big ethical and philosophical questions, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Like if our choices, our thoughts, our very identities are just patterns of motion, then what does that mean for free will and moral responsibility?
Right. Can we consciously shape these patterns, or are we just passengers on a predetermined course?
It's a deep question. And if we are just motion, what kind of motion do we want to create in the world? What kind of legacy do we want to leave behind?
How can we use this understanding of motion to create a more harmonious and flourishing world for ourselves and future generations?
Exactly. And, you know, in the spirit of the source's playful tone, I'd like to challenge our listeners to think about this. What's the most fascinating motion pattern that you create?
I love that. It's a great reminder that even though we might be part of this larger cosmic dance of motion, each of us has our own unique rhythm, our own signature move.
Right. We have the power to shape the patterns of motion that define our lives and influence the world around us.
And who knows, maybe by understanding these patterns of motion, we can learn to dance even more beautifully, more consciously, and more in harmony with the universe itself.
That's a beautiful thought.
Yes.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. This deep dive has given us so much to think about. The nature of reality, our place in the universe, the power of motion.
It's been a mind-bending exploration for sure.
It really has. And we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those motion-seeking minds engaged.
Keep diving deep, everybody.
Until next time.